Hello, my name is Georgia Court. Welcome. I'm so glad you are here for this evening's event. And just a couple of pieces of business before we get going. And that is, please stay muted during the presentation so that you don't pop up as the main speaker. That can be a little embarrassing, particularly if you're in your pajamas or drinking your second glass of wine or whatever. So in any case, just go on mute. Once the presentation is finished, then I will invite you to unmute, because then we'll have a Q&A and a discussion with our authors tonight. And that's always the best part for me. So I like when that happens. But one announcement I'd like you to have, this talk tonight is part of our April-long series about Florida, a focus on Florida. And you may be interested to know that our next event in this series is April 22nd at 2 p.m. in the afternoon, and that's with Amy Green. Amy Green is a journalist, and she'll be writing about her book, talking about her book, Moving Water, the Everglades and Big Sugar. So it's about politics and money and the environment, and I think it's going to be an excellent presentation. So mark your calendars, RSVP for that at sarasotobooks.com, just like you probably RSVP'd for this one. Okay. Also, one other piece of information in the chat, at the very top of the chat, I have put links for purchasing of both Tyler's book and Sarah's book. And there's a direct link to bookstore number 1 to purchase it there. So that's in the chat at the very top. So take a look for that. Okay, I think we're about ready to go. I want to introduce our 2 guests tonight. Tyler Gillespie is a 5th generation Floridian. He's a poet and an award-winning journalist. He has written for GQ, The Guardian, The Nation, Vice, and Salon. He's the author of Florida Man Poems and co-editor of The Awkward Phase, the uplifting tales of those weird kids you went to school with. Now that sounds like a good one. I haven't read that yet. He will be in conversation with Sarah Gerard. Sarah is the author of the novels Binary Star and True Love, and the essay collection Sunshine State. Her short stories, essays, and interviews have appeared in Guernica, the New York Times, T Magazine, Granta, The Baffler, The Believer, Vice, Electric Literature, and the anthologies We Can't Help If We're From Florida, One Small Blow Against Encroaching Totalitarianism, Volume 2, and Tampa Bay Noir. Please welcome Tyler Gillespie and Sarah Gerard.
Georgia, thank you so much. Tyler, the day has come.
It's here.
Can't believe it. Wow. And, you know, I've had such a pleasure watching you work on this book and talking to you about it as it came together. And also, you know, I think did this journey begin with the Florida Man book of poems that I saw you launch a couple years ago?
The essay started before the poems. I stopped after Pulse happened and kind of focused more on poetry.
Yeah.
And we can talk about that maybe later.
Yeah, for sure. Well, I think a really good introduction to this book, for those who haven't read it yet, would be a reading by you to kind of introduce us and get our feet wet, and then maybe we can talk about this subtitle.
Awesome. And I want to first thank everyone for coming and for Georgia in the bookstore. And I want to thank Sarah so much for reading the book. And I've been such a fan of your work for so long now. So it is such a pleasure to be here with you. Thank you. So I'm going to read from Florida Man Theory, which is the first chapter after the introduction, and that kind of frames the book, and it's the first essay I started writing, and that was back in about 2015. Florida Man theory. I have a theory that any true Floridian is less than 5 degrees of separation from a Florida Man story. A headline like Florida Man in pirate costume arrested for firing black powder guns. My theory rests on a Floridian knowing the neighbor's son, a Florida man learns hard way that he stole laxatives, not opioids. Since Florida Man can also be Florida woman, a Floridian might know a friend's cousin who went viral as Florida woman charged with stealing rental car says demons took it. In my case, a family member called the cops when a drug deal went wrong. Her dealer tried to rob her, and she wanted him to get arrested for it. I found the pre-viral Florida Man story in one local newspaper. The story happened in the early 2000s, so it's all but buried on the internet. In the mid-2000s, Spark.com, a website with the tagline, "We don't make the news, we mock it," began to track weird Florida news and contributed to the genesis of Florida as an internet meme. A major increase in searches for the term Florida Man later occurred in June 2012, around the time of the viral Miami cannibal story. A guy had reportedly smoked bath salts and chewed off the face of a homeless man who had passed out near a road. The cannibal story was shocking, fear-inducing, twisted, and sad. The victim went through a slow and difficult recovery. The story was also morbidly intriguing to some, and it became a primer for Florida Man, who has been described as a Yankee nightmare in human form, and everything frightening about white trash life in one meme. Florida Man entered the cultural zeitgeist soon after the cannibal story. An associate editor at GQ noticed the Florida attention and created the @FloridaMan Twitter account to make his colleagues laugh. The account received nearly 64,000 followers its first month. The account used a mugshot of a man with black marker all over his face. The man was not an actual Florida man, but a man arrested in Indiana for trying to attack his roommate with a sword. The account's headlines contained an element of wildness, hopelessness, and physicality. Florida Man may have been out of control, but he had a certain ingenuity, often fueled by drugs and/or alcohol. The internet loved these headlines and their accompanying mugshots. Florida Man may as well have been the mayor of Reddit, with over 500,000 members in the subreddit dedicated to the news about the terrible superhero Florida Man and his latest misadventures. He lodged himself into pop culture depicted on the TV show Atlanta. He had his own beard, tour guide, and music festival, once headlined by the indie rock band Weezer. He's apparently quite lucrative. And then I'm going to skip a little bit ahead just to see we can have a little bit of how the book is kind of framed. So this is a new section, the next section. Floridians have never exactly maintained a pristine reputation. We've behaved badly since statehood. Historians called antebellum Florida a rogue's paradise. Those Floridians like to carry weapons, and alcohol may have led to frontier violence. A penchant for alcohol and violence persisted and may have contributed to 1895's reported cutting affray, when Chaz stepped in front of Sam in line at the butcher shop. Sam's brother ran into the butcher shop to get a knife. He tried to stab Chaz. The scrum lasted until blood was seen, and the perpetrators fled to the woods to face later arrest. I could almost understand fighting over a long wait for a good piece of meat, but I couldn't get down with a turn-of-the-century man who killed his sweetheart. The story discussed a husband who asked his wife to stroll by sunlight through the meadow and green pastures. On this stroll, the wife apparently told him she could no longer be with him for all he is worth. 3 shots were fired. The paper made it seem like the husband killed his wife, but the jury held an inquest over the body, and the verdict was that the shooting was accidental. They let him go.
It's so impressive how deep your research goes for this book. But I want to start our conversation with this subtitle, Exploring a Misunderstood State. Do you think of this book as a corrective to the Florida Man stereotype? And if you do, if the answer is yes, how did you go about deconstructing that stereotype, getting underneath it?
I think that that's such a great question. And I think that it's like so ubiquitous that this book and, maybe a part of that, hopefully, I really hope we can combat that stereotype. And I think that by showing Floridians and their lives and their complexities and their humanity instead of just the headline is kind of what I was trying to do with the chapters in this book and connecting it to some of our history and kind of explaining it that way.
The chapters you chose very specific subjects, and they're stereotypically Florida subjects on the surface, alligators, for instance,
Right.
but also well-known problems here, like the invasive species that are running rampage across the state. Those make national headlines sometimes when they, you talk about the pythons in the Everglades, or the red tide, which was a national headline. And so, so these subjects in your book, did you choose these with an eye toward catching people's attention, but then doing something unexpected with it?
I think that developed as I was writing. So I think most of the stories started as I saw them for publication in a journal, like a magazine or a newspaper. And so with alligators, I've just been obsessed with them, of course, for the longest. So that story, I was so interested in this story about, so these really luxury brands like Hermes and these really like big brands, they have alligator farms in Louisiana. And I was obsessed with this idea of like these Cajun men farming alligators for luxury brands. And so that kind of got me thinking about what is the alligator as more than an animal, being a product, and being hunted. And so that was kind of too a misconception, that alligators are these mean creatures and that we need to be afraid of them, but they're actually really important to the ecosystem, right? Like they're keystone creatures, right? And so just thinking about the complexity of the alligator, for example, that I kind of took for granted, just seeing them. Like I went on a walk the other day, I saw 3 alligators, So kind of that's how I feel about Florida too, is there's Florida's a keystone creature and sometimes we don't always get that recognition.
Yeah, and you go so deep with your subjects. I mean, the research that you're doing, first of all, it has this historical depth that is pretty fascinating. I mean, you're interviewing people who are 6th and 7th generation Floridians. You yourself are a 5th generation Floridian, and well, so I guess I wonder, do you think it's that level of detail that is able, or do you think it takes that level of detail or familiarity to kind of open people's eyes to what something really is? For instance, they think they understand the alligator, but they don't really understand what an alligator is, But also, do you consider yourself a Florida historian?
Historians would probably say no. So I think a Florida storyteller is probably how I would identify, right? So I do think I would have to say kind of, if any historians are here, maybe that, I think kind of, but I think those personal lived stories and those lived experiences are really important to historical records. And that's not always kind of counted as part of historical scholarship. So I could see that, yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, and I mean, but do you think there's some representation that has been lacking, with these? I mean, are you collecting these oral stories, from people who maybe have been overlooked by history too?
I think so. And I think one of the misconceptions, and as a Floridian born here, sometimes people don't think, people always, a lot of the time say to me, there are no native Floridians. I'll be like, I'm a native Floridian. They'll be like so surprised by that. I've never met anyone from Florida. Even folks living in Florida will sometimes say that to me. But I think that's one misconception is Florida has a lot of, like 8th generation Floridians, and they have a long history and a lot connection to the lands too, which is what I really found interesting. Because when I was kind of writing about the environmental issues, that's when I talk to the Floridian, I think thinking about it now, those are the Floridians who had the longest connection, who had been here the longest, because they've worked the land. I'm thinking about the cattle farmers
I was just
specifically,
thinking about them
the
too.
ranchers.
Yeah. Yeah, and in that's a perfect example actually of kind of getting underneath the stereotype too of, people think they understand what it's like to be a rancher or what a rancher's life is like, or we have this idea of industrial agriculture and cows and feedlots, but then, what was your experience when you actually went and talked to these people?
It was I love that story in there. I love it because also there's a cowboy love story going on, which is there's like a love story in there. I was honestly, so thinking about that, I was a little nervous because I'm talking to these cowboys, about their ranching practices, and there's a lot of I think they're having more conversations, but there is a lot of misconception. Like they told me, some people really have strong reactions against their like ranching and the cattle, and these images of industrial farming are so prevalent and they're so serious, right? But that's what a lot of people just think that farming is. So these small ranchers, I think, are not necessarily skeptical, but you have to you have to really listen, and especially the one rancher, he was very reticent. He didn't really want to talk, but the longer that I spent with him and just listened to what he was saying, he opened up more to me. And so that was really fun, I think.
You spend a really good amount of time with all of your subjects, and it's clear that you find each of them, that you do that in order to find their humanity. Each one of these people, all of these people, and you're a participatory journalist. You call yourself that at one point, and it's a school of journalism and a philosophy of journalism, that says that participation is, it is a core tool in your toolkit, right? But I had the sense that when you were writing this essay about the Civil War reenactors, the Confederate reenactors, that presented a challenge for you. Can you talk about that journalistically? What were your challenges, and why did you want to write about these reenactors?
That was very challenging one, because, well, connecting to the cattle, Civil War, or cattle was one of Florida's main contributions to the Civil War. So that piece comes directly in conversation with the one about the ranchers. And I didn't realize that, right? I didn't honestly realize Florida had any role in the Civil War until I was an adult. I didn't honestly learn that, or maybe I did, I forgot it. The history I knew was the Fountain of Youth, which is,
Yeah.
mythology.
Yeah.
So I didn't really even know that until an adult, but like I write about in the book, I found a bib with a Confederate flag and my name on it. And so thinking about, well, if I was a Floridian back in the day, I would have fought for the Confederacy, most likely, and what does that mean for the implications for me now? How do I think about that in terms of Florida's history to race and to all of these different things, right? So I really wanted to talk to the Civil War reenactors because I also find reenacting fascinating. Like everything that I write about, I'm just like kind of obsessed with. I'm like, why are people doing this?
It actually kind of reminds me of the drag essay a little bit. I feel like it's in conversation with the drag essay. Like this is kind of a form of drag.
Right. That's so interesting to put it that way. And then, so for I really thought that I needed to be a reenactor. That's the kind of writer I am, just throw myself in there. But then my friend and I write about it, which I think, is part of maybe my privilege, or like just wanting to go too hard with it, is my friend was like, you cannot do that, because if there's a photo of you in a Confederate outfit and it circulates online, like it's so decontextualized.
Right.
Kind of like these Florida Man headlines are decontextualized.
Right. Yeah. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
No, please go ahead.
So I was just wanted to say, so like that was made me think about that. And I was also very concerned about being like an out journal, like an out gay man, and these very spaces that I considered probably to be not very friendly to that as well. But so yeah, those were some of my considerations, right?
Mhm.
Yeah.
And how did you feel interviewing some of these people? How do you sort of maintain your your journalistic objectivity, in some of these conversations?
I found it, I just, in the moment, that's the thing, is I'm just kind of hearing stories and I'm collecting, I'm not, and then I'll kind of reflect on it. But I found that the folks that I talked to really had thought about why they were doing what they were doing. And like I said in the book, I don't know those conversations that I don't have access to, right? So I still don't know what they talked about when it was just the boys around the campfire or whatever, right?
Right.
But from what I had long periods of time with folks to kind of hear what they were saying, and a lot of the folks were connecting it to their own ancestry because they were Floridians, and their ancestors had fought so in the Civil War, and specific, they get very specific. They know what day, all of that kind of thing. And so I kind of felt like we were in a similar situation trying to figure out like what it means to be a Floridian for us. And that was like a way that they were working through it, at least some of the folks. I was working through it in a different kind of way. So I did see a kind of similar kind of goal of why we were doing what we were doing. And I think that I try not to be judgmental because at the end of the day, I still really don't know. I'm just like presenting what I'm seeing and what I'm thinking, and not making any judgments about if it's the right or wrong thing for people to be doing.
Let's connect, because you mentioned earlier sort of how you felt as an out gay man in that situation, and that comes up in so many essays throughout the book. And especially there were two. Well, the other day you and I met up at a park nearby. We both
Our favorite park.
park. Went for a little walk with the turtles, and I asked you what your favorite essay is in this book, and you said it was the last one. And I asked you why, and you said it was the most personal to you. And that was really interesting to me because obviously I can see that it's a very personal essay, but another essay in this book is just as personal and hit me really deep. And that's the one, Young and Beautiful Forever. And which is about growing up gay in conservative Florida, and the history of the AIDS epidemic here, and the Pulse nightclub shooting in which you lost some friends. And that, and you go into detail about that loss. And the last essay is also about growing up gay in Florida, but it strikes me as being a little more lighthearted. So I was kind of surprised that you said that it was the most personal to you. It's obviously personal. It's about growing up gay in the Southern Baptist Church. There's also a very interesting and kind of funny scene in which you visit the Holy Land Experience theme park in Orlando, and you describe its bejeweled history or its bedazzled history. And
yes, Jan Kraus, obsessed with her.
Yeah. So I wonder if you can just talk about those two essays. And do you still agree that the last one feels like the most personal to you?
I think I wrote the last one the most recently, and folks have wanted to talk to me about that one the most, I think, because, faith communities and for queer people or just people that maybe have a past that doesn't necessarily seem to be able to fit into whatever faith community they grew up in. I think it has connected with them. So I've been able to have like some conversations about that. Because I was a Southern Baptist, right? And I grew up in going to a Southern Baptist school that I would get kicked out of if I came out, right? And then when I came to be an out gay person, thinking, well, a lot of my queer friends and family were not like, they're like, you can't be gay and a Christian, So then it was kind of, because of their trauma or just their own theological conceptions. So just coming to a place where I can stand in my own faith and my own ideas is really important to me, and connects back to Florida and my family and all of these, my childhood. And I don't want to be cut off from that. But yeah, and I definitely think writing about yeah, I mean, yeah, that, I mean, you're right. That is definitely more personal and something that I, you know, still feel super close to the bone writing about Pulse. And, but it just felt necessary to write about that, because I'm writing about how different people responded to the shooting. And so it felt like I needed to do that. But yeah, that's definitely the most close to the bone thing that I talk about. Even though I talk about a lot of personal stuff now that I'm thinking about it.
I mean, yeah, this book is, for so much of this book, well, I mean, you're a first person journalist, so there's always the possibility that you could kind of slip into memoir, but for so much of this book, you're approaching things very journalistically. And I found it kind of funny the other day when we were at the Turtle Park, when you said that you wanted to interview me today. And I was like, but Tyler, it's your book launch. And you were like, yeah, but I just feel more comfortable interviewing other people. And I was like, too bad. I'm gonna turn the camera. It's your day.
Right.
So is that uncomfortable for you, writing memoir?
So the earliest drafts of the book was so much more reported, so much, and then I had moments of memoir in there to connect these seemingly disparate threads that I think all tie together, and using myself as a way to tie them together and to add humor, because I feel much more comfortable being self-deprecating or joking about myself than other things. And then so my editors and my agents and readers were like, we want more of this. Because yeah, it's like I'm dealing with, AIDS and that piece that you're talking about, the AIDS epidemic and Pulse, and it's about also aging, being an aging queer person. There are not the same communities because of AIDS and other, just aging in general. I'm living with my grandmother right now. She's here listening to this. Sarah says hi. She says hi. But those things are very important to me, but also I think being able to talk about that in a way that's not, I feel like humor is so important to be like a release valve, right? So I was really resistant to putting myself in there, but then after drafting, I think that I figured out a way to do it that I feel comfortable with.
I wonder if you'll read a little bit more so we can talk about the animals in this.
Yes. Okay, so I'm actually going to read about an alligator. Somebody interviewed me for this recently, and she was talking about how this was one of her favorite stories. And I was like, I love it too. And it connects to the Florida man, like, myth, and it also connects to alligators. So this starts on page 88, and it is in like the second section of the book, or the chapter. So I'm talking about the history of alligators as economic engines in Florida for tourism. So just kind of context. And I talk about alligator wrestling as another form of that. So in Mary Thorne's show, the Floridian had swum with 41 alligators in a central Florida pit. She worked with the gators every day and knew which ones were the most aggressive. I had a gator that on command would show me his privates, she said. Another I could pick up and kiss right on the mouth. Mary in her mid-50s reminded me of my great Aunt Annie, who used to feed her backyard gators. I admired these Florida women because they didn't take bull from anyone or any animal. Mary cared for her first gator as a little kid. Her brother owned a fish hatchery, and she fished gators out to play with her Barbie dolls. The mother of 7 never wrestled gators, but she did wrestle people. In a past life, she performed professionally under the name Biker Babe as part of the Triple X team. The great Malenko, who made a name for himself in championship wrestling, had trained her. Mary carried on the great Malenko's legacy after he died. She body slammed people for almost 40 years in the ring before she retired to perform with gators. I have been bitten twice by gators, she said, once in the head and once in the knee. As part of her show, Mary circled a gator to let it know they were about to perform. Things went fine until mating season. A female gator climbed into the enclosure, and Mary didn't know she was in there. The gator nabbed her by the head. Thankfully, there was a second person in the enclosure to save her. Mary's other gator bite occurred when she tried to show people how high gators can jump on land. An older woman tripped and fell into the pit. Mary stepped in front of the gator to help her. This gator bit Mary in the knee. Most gator attacks won't kill you, she said, but you will lose part of your body. Like if you're feeding the gator, you're gonna lose your hand or your fingers or have some scars on them. Mary's job at the gator show led to the ownership of her first alligators. FWC staff members brought 5 little gators in an aquarium to her boss. He couldn't take care of them, so she decided to get her permit and take them home. The FWC said people could keep an American alligator for educational purposes, exhibition, or sale if they obtained the proper permits and license. There's a lot of people who own gators without their neighbors knowing, said Mary. They could be living next to you because in Florida, you can get a license to keep a gator inside and do education with it. License applicants had to demonstrate 1 year and 1,000 hours of substantial practical experience with the care of alligators or other crocodilian species. Mary's gators, Rambo, Oscar, and Alyssa, had been poached as hatchlings and kept in a dark closet for years. They had little room to move and a small aquarium. Mary said they'd been in the dark for so long, their immune system was shot. The gators couldn't function properly, so Mary began to give them physical therapy. She soon found out the extent of damage done by the darkness. They couldn't take the sun. I had one sitting by the window, she said, and the filter light through the window actually killed the gator. I asked Dr. Laura Brandt, senior wildlife biologist for the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, about the possibility of sun-sensitive gators. She said, perhaps they would have some sun sensitivity initially, like you would have if you were kept in the dark. Mary realized the gator's sun sensitivity. She thought, if humans can do sunscreen, then gators can too. That's how her gators ended up wearing clothes. She lathered them in sunscreen and dressed them in biker gear and a Santa outfit for Christmas. Somehow, she didn't lose a finger in the process. Mary's permits allowed her to keep alligators until they reached 6 feet in length. She did not live on the required acres of land needed to keep bigger gators. Mary planned to rehab the gators and then take them to a facility like Gatorland in Orlando. Mary did this for all but Rambo. She didn't want to drop him off at one of the professional facilities because of his sun sensitivity. She feared his weakened immune system would get him eaten by other gators. FWC told her she had to find Rambo a new home because of his size. As Rambo inched towards 6 feet, she found it difficult to part with him. Her son died during her battle for Rambo, and she became even more attached to the gator she had raised. I decided I wasn't going to get rid of Rambo, she said. They were going to have to shoot me before I got rid of him.
It really strikes me. No, sorry. Well, because I have so many questions already for you from this, like, there's so much that we can read into just this one short story of Mary and Rambo, about the human condition, about Florida and its laws, about our relationship to animal species. And there are so many animals in this book too. There's alligators, there's various invasive species throughout Florida, the wild boar, the pythons, all of the animals that appear at the Tampa Repticon that you attended, so many species of frogs and lizard, as well as tarantulas, mice, and I think rabbits to feed to the reptiles, you know?
That's what someone told me, yeah.
I guess I have 2 questions for you, Tyler. The first is, you don't even like reptiles. Why do you think about them so much?
I am afraid of most reptiles, yes.
So maybe is that why? But the second question is, what are earlier you called alligators a keystone species. So what are animals telling you about Florida?
I think that, I've always been afraid of the reptile. And as a writer, I'm just really interested in figuring out what I don't understand or what I'm afraid of. So that's also like compels me to understand that, because I feel like that's really important for me to be able to kind of live in this world in a kind of way. And I think that's the thing about alligators is I had been so afraid of them, but like I said, they were so important. And so they're telling us, I think, to your question, that these animals that we may not understand have stories and are complex, just like every human. And like the boars, I'm terrified of the boars. They get to be so big. But as I write in another chapter, they at one point were able to help the ranchers survive and pay their bills when they couldn't. So that's the thing. It's like in one day in Florida, which is so fascinating about the state, one day what will save the state, the next day is what will hurt it.
That's very well put. And is this at what point when you were writing this book, did you realize that it was a book? Was that something that you kind of discovered along the way, or did you decide, I'm at a certain point in my career, it's time I published a book?
I think a little bit of both. Once I was saying that I had a kind of theme going on with, these stories about misconceptions or fears and just about general Florida things, I thought, okay, a book will allow me to expand them, because if I'm writing, I don't have the space, can't use the first person, I can't use the archival text as much, stuff like that. So it just allowed me to have more space to really think through these topics.
What did you want to include in the book that you hadn't already written about?
I really wanted to write more about the LGBTQ community and aging in Florida. I think aging in Florida is such a big story, not just for the LGBT community, but just, what networks and systems do we have for our senior citizens? And that's just really near to my heart. So I wanted to be able to write about that. I really wanted to write about drag queens. So.
There are not enough essays about drag queens.
I agree. I think so.
Let's face it. But also, you're so right about aging in Florida and how you're right. It's a huge story and it touches all of us. And especially this year, a lot of us have moved back in with our families, and we see our parents aging up close for the first time, and or like you've moved back in with grandma, and you're helping her and she's helping you too, and it's not something that we see really explored enough, or rather I should say it's not a conversation that we can ever have enough. So what does grandma think of the book? Does she like it? Does she love the cover?
What do you think of the book, Grandma? Gramel? She's pausing.
I think it's a good read.
It's a good read.
And it brings back a lot of memories.
Brings back a lot of memories.
And my father was a great
She's telling a story about her dad.
Storyteller.
Her dad was a great storyteller, so I inherited that. She's a great storyteller as well. So
That's what was my mom, but my dad, mom was always working when we were home.
she's still going.
Dad would, fill us with stories.
Yes. So she was just talking about how our mom and dad were always telling stories and how, that's how we spend a lot of our time. And she tells me a lot of stories. There was no TV.
That's how so many of us became writers, right?
Yeah, sitting at the table with grandma talking about life.
How did you know this book was done?
When I hit the word count, okay, like that's the practical thing. But also I think that it really felt like the right time. So the last essay talks about COVID, right? Like that's how, we were in the earlier stages and about community and how this church community was able to find a community virtually and what that looks like. Cause like what you're saying about community, right? So it felt like a really it felt like a timely end to stop the project, and it felt like stop the book. And it also, I think, like you were saying, a lot of my writing is participatory. So to go places and interview people I can't do in the same ways. And I also feel like I had said everything that I wanted to say in this moment about Florida. So it just felt like it was done.
So now what are you working on? Don't you hate that question?
I kind of love it because what I'm working on now is about Florida as well. It's about specifically LGBTQ communities in Florida, and the reason why I appreciate that question is because I'm looking for people to interview. So if anybody is interested in, Floridians who, I'm looking at how communities in different parts of the state formed around writing and text and stuff like that. I also just finished, another poetry manuscript. So I got to sit on that and sleep on that for a little while to see if I still like it in a few months. you know.
I know. hmm But I love the feeling when you go back and you actually do like it and you're like, yes, I wasn't wrong, But,
Yeah.
and it's just a matter of time. You have to let enough time pass, right?
Mhm.
Be okay with it again, so it doesn't feel icky anymore.
Especially when it comes to, I feel like with poetry and with book, just make sure the structure is feeling right and reads, a few months later in the same way that I would want it to.
Yeah, for sure. Well, my favorite Florida man, we should open it up to the audience, see if anybody else has questions, perhaps.
Yeah,
George?
anyone want to say anything? I will take you to gallery view so I can see people. So if you're interested in a question, either raise your real hand or do the online hand and unmute yourselves, please, and then you can participate in the conversation. So who wants to go first?
I'm just going to randomly call on people like they used to do in school.
Okay.
To
This
help
will work. We'll see how this goes, Sarah. Okay.
Yeah.
I see Susan though with her hand up.
Yeah, I have a question for Tyler. Tyler, I just started the book, but already I see the humor in it. And a lot of it is self-deprecating, which you mentioned earlier. But it's all a warm-hearted kind of humor, both towards yourself and towards your state. And I was just wondering if you always knew that humor would be a big part of this book.
Yeah, well, so I think that's such a lovely question. I really appreciate that. I used to, so I grew up being the very serious kid who read Shakespeare and wanted to memorize the dictionary. I was not interested in, being funny or any of that. But then I went through college, whatever. Then I went through a breakup and I moved to Chicago. And then I started taking improv classes. And I never understood how powerful humor would be, until I started taking those classes to get over a broken heart, but also just life is so tough. And so to have a moment of levity has gotten through me a lot of hard times. So I started to then integrate that into my own writing, sometimes more successful, or in the early days, not as successfully, I think, as now. But yeah, I always knew that it would be some kind of humor because that's what life is complex, and to me there's always humorous moments, like even especially when we're dealing with such difficult topics like AIDS, like I think it can be really overwhelming for a reader and for a person to be reading that. So I think a little bit of humor can be really helpful at certain moments. And for me, never making fun of, like, that's something when people talk about Florida, and the jokes are really there. There's the jokes are really there, very easy. And I don't want to go for an easy joke. So.
Who else would like to say something?
I'm also going to put the link. So my grandmother and I did a podcast where we were talking about books and we interviewed Sarah. So I'm going to throw that in the link as well in the chat.
And I see Michelle, looks like she has a question.
Yeah. Hey, Tyler. So I was wondering if you could talk, I know you talked a good bit about process, but I'm wondering if you could get kind of specific about you know, when you used interviews, do you transcribe it and then begin to develop an essay around that? How do you meld this journalistic style with your, you know, personal narrative sort of style?
So what I did for a lot of the essays is I will be recording what the people are saying while they're saying it. And Florida is a two-party consent state, meaning that both parties have to consent. Not every state is like that. I mean, I'm just throwing that out there. So they know I'm recording is basically what I'm talking about. And so thinking about for like the Civil War reenactors, I'm recording what's happening. Sometimes I'll put it in my shirt pocket just because I'm also taking notes. And I'm also taking photos. So for me, I'm not really interested in what someone was wearing or what the house looked like. I like what was the person doing, what was the person saying. I'm interested in that human behavior. So I take photos of the scene so then I can go back and write those details in because I know just me as a person, it's not as important to me as a behavior kind of thing. And then so when I get back, I'll transcribe the interviews and then I will try to put it together. Usually I'll know like with the Python hunters or with, I'll have a main character, you know, I'll have main characters that I know I'm gonna follow. But then what's really fun and what just kind of what I love to do is those side people that you were not expecting to talk to that you did not know. Like when I was talking to the Python hunters, there's this amazing moment where so I'm with like these two guys who are like smoking pot and like hunting snakes, you know, and then up in the Everglades drives this black SUV, out gets this blonde haired 20-year-old like USF student looking glamorous, you know, she loves to hunt snakes too. And then there's this moment where she's talking to the snake hunters and I'm like, I live for that, you know what I mean? And you can't really know that's going to happen, but you just have to kind of be in the moment.
Awesome.
Thank you.
Yeah, who else? Yes, Dahlia.
Yes, hi. I have two questions. Am I allowed two questions? Just gonna do it. I'm just gonna
As
take
many
it.
as you want. Okay.
Okay, so my first question, I would love to know if there was anything that got left out that was near and dear to your heart that was on the cutting room floor of this book. If there's a character or story or something that didn't make it that you want to give space to now.
I did a lot more interviews with people than I included, of course, just for narrative purposes. So I love that question. There was the one that pops to my head is I have this story about a 911 operator who is just talking about the difficulties and the struggles of that position. And just, I don't know, I just really felt that and it didn't fit into what I was trying to do. And I do love a tangent, but that felt a little bit too much. And I have an essay about Hulk Hogan. I was working on that, like I was talking to Sarah about that. And it just didn't fit with what I was doing. And then as I was writing the book, I'm like, I don't think I want to write about Hulk Hogan anymore. Like I'm not interested in him. But you know, I grew up living, he's just always been a part of like, because his family used to live in Clearwater, like near me, like, so he's a Floridian kind of person.
So my second question is, I'm a longtime Florida fan. I'm a recovering Yankee, and something that I've just always appreciated about your work, and that I think I just started the book, and something that seems very clear as a theme to me is just sort of like what you touched on a little bit of just how, you know, the things that could save the state are also the things that could ruin the state. And there seems to be just sort of this balance in Florida, or this idea that there's like something that I see in your work a lot is just that there's a place for everyone here. And I guess I'm just wondering, you know, what if there is anything that you discovered about through writing this book that you discovered about Florida or your relationship to it that you didn't know or realize before?
I think how important like the land, the environment and the land is to me. I mean, it's always been kind of, you know, alligators, kayaking, you know, but just really thinking about how much damage we've done as a people to the lands. It just makes me really sad, you know. I know that. And just thinking about that, because in part of it, I was reading a lot of these archival texts, and so seeing how they used to describe the lands, and yeah, you know, this a very fantastical place, but thinking about how the Everglades, how big the Everglades is, and in the water, and just thinking about how important it is, and it's so hard to imagine that now, right? So I think that just kind of how I feel about the land, I articulated to myself in a way that I hadn't before.
I think you really, there's that theme of precarity that is throughout this that I think is you nailed really well. So
Thank you.
Yeah, other comments? Yes, Kathy.
I'm interested, you said you were interested in writing about aging in Florida, and as you can probably see from my gray hair, I'm interested in that topic too. But I wondered what your angle or your approach to it, or if you're gotten that far in your planning.
So I do have one chapter in here about aging, and it's specifically about the LGBTQ community, because what we found, or what folks have found is, you know, there maybe have been that thought process that my kids may be able to take care of me when I'm older. And then a lot of, you know, gay people don't have children, so they don't have that network. And then also a lot of folks passed away because due to the AIDS crisis, the AIDS pandemic. So they don't have those friends as well. Not everybody, not to be general, but these are some specific issues. And then also another issue is like when same-sex partners or just gay people go to their doctors, it can be a very difficult conversation for a lot of people to have. So like one person I interviewed said he knows a lot of people who go back into the closet when they're older and their doctor in the healthcare. So I looked at like, I interviewed someone who's interested in affordable housing, because also how we, you know, with pension plans, with people's money situations, is not necessarily how it used to be. So how can people survive? So I was looking about what affordable housing would look like, specifically for the LGBTQ community. And they have a lot of really cool and interesting ideas. But what he says in the book is that not enough people are talking about it. And they really think that this needs to become a bigger national issue, like celebrities are behind it, and that's how important it is, right? And he says, I do love that essay, because he's like, you never think about getting older until you're older.
You don't have to be gay to have those thoughts. I mean, I don't think any of us think about being older until we're actually faced with it.
I'm thinking about it right now.
Maybe you should wait.
Yeah, you have a few more years to worry heavily about it.
I really appreciate that question.
Yeah. Any other comments before we say good night?
I want to quickly, before we say goodnight, Sarah's book is coming out in paperback in June. It is a lovely book. My grandmother and I both read it. We talk about it in the podcast. It's for sale. She is an amazing writer, and her book, Sunshine State Essays, is brilliant and lovely as well.
Oh, that's a terrific book, I have to say, and it's been a bestseller, I think, in the bookstore. So for quite a while.
And it should go on a display with this essential Florida book, which
I would imagine it will be there. Yeah. Well, that's great. And I wanted to remind you all that in the chat, when we got started, I put a link to where you can buy both Sarah's book and Tyler's book. It's at the top of the chat. So if you go to your chat screen and scroll all the way at the top, you'll find those links if you're interested in that. So unless there's another question or comment, we will call it a night. And I thank you, Sarah and Tyler. It has been delightful to be with you. And thank everybody for coming.
Congratulations, Tyler.
Thank you all for coming. It was so lovely. Thank you, Georgia. I appreciate it.
Thank you.
Bookstore number 1.
Good night.
Night.